Okay, so this video is going to talk about the effects of a price ceiling in a market. In the book, they talk about both binding and non-binding price ceilings and price floors. I'm just going to focus on the binding case. So a price ceiling, to start with, is a legal maximum price that could be imposed on a good or service. And it would be a natural response to saying, like, hey, if the price of, and, I've got this drawn here for milk, you say, hey, the price of milk is too high. Why don't we do something about it? Like, why doesn't Congress, why does the legislature do something about it? And a natural thing to say, well, why don't we pass a law outlawing a high price for milk or lowering the price for milk? And essentially, that's what a price ceiling might do. So it's set a maximum price of milk. So if the equilibrium price of milk is like $3.50 a gallon, it might say milk's going to be $2 a gallon, and that's going to be the most that you can sell it for. And so you can have the price could be less than that, but it would be illegal to sell milk for more than the price ceiling amount of specified price. So it will assume that this law can get enforced relatively well. We'll come back to that when we talk about a black market as one of the effects. So we have demand and supply, and I have the graph drawn here to show the equilibrium. So the equilibrium in this market, as in any case with supply and demand, is going to be where supply intersects demand, or at the price at which the quantity demand equals the quantity supply. For a price ceiling to have effects in the market, it would have to be set below the price. So again, it would be the natural thing to try to say, hey, milk's too expensive. Families struggle to be able to afford enough milk to raise their children. So let's do something about it. Let's pass a law lowering the price of milk. And so it would have to be lower than the equilibrium price. Now, at any price that's below the equilibrium, you go over to the supply curve and the demand curve. And the quantity supplied when you hit the supply curve would be QS in this diagram. And you have to keep going until you hit the demand curve and go down, and that will give you the quantity demanded that's labeled here as QD. Now, so one of the things is that, as we first said in chapter 3, talk about getting to equilibrium, we have a shortage in this market. And when quantity demand is greater than the quantity supply, there's a shortage in the market. Now, if there were no price ceiling in this market, we'd say there's an upward pressure on the price, because at this price, the more people want to buy milk than the milk is available. Sellers will see that. They'll see that milk is selling out, and they'll look to raise the price. But if the price is at the legal maximum, sellers will not be willing to raise the price because it would be illegal. They would presumably be fined. They would be shut down somehow. And again, we'll just assume that this law is getting enforced right now. So there's upward pressure on the price, but the sellers won't raise the price because they would face legal action for violating the law. It would violate the law for them. This was a $2 price ceiling on the price of milk to sell milk for $3 a gallon. So they will not raise the price. This shortage in the market that we've identified will persist. Now, a second thing to do is that not only is there a shortage in the market, but in a market, transactions have to be voluntary. And although we have our price ceiling in place, and that's in some sense inhibiting voluntary transactions that still occur have to be voluntary. That means for any milk that's going to be bought or sold in the marketplace, there would have to be a willing buyer and a willing seller. We know that there's a lot more willing buyers at the price ceiling price than there are sellers, but it also means that the quantity of milk that will be available is the quantity supply, and that's QS. If we compare the equilibrium quantity with the quantity of with the QS, the quantity of milk available under the price ceiling, we can see that QS is less than QE. It's necessarily going to lie to the left of QE. So there's going to be less milk available. So if we started this whole thing saying the price of milk is too high, we need to give families milk at a more affordable price, the price ceiling will not completely have attained that goal, because only this smaller quantity of milk will actually be available at the price ceiling price. There'll be less milk available. So yeah, the milk that's available is going to be sold for less, but there will be less of it available. Some people who were drinking milk, if there's kids, some kids who were drinking milk at the equilibrium will not now. So there's not just a not just a shortage. There's less milk available. If you put a price ceiling on something, there's going to be less of that good available. And so, that's in one sense our basic effect here. Does the price ceiling achieve its goal of trying to lower the price of milk? Well, in part because the price of milk is lower, but and anybody who's able to buy milk at that price would be able to get it for a lower price. But there's less milk available, so some people who were able to buy milk before won't have it now. So that's a nice low price, but it may not be available. So you can debate as to whether or not the price ceiling is attaining its goals. But there could be some additional effects in here that we need to explore that could actually lead the price ceiling to be less effective than suggested here. One thing is that since there's a shortage of the good, there are more buyers than sellers. The good is going to have to, the available quantities of the good are going to have to be, in effect, rationed somehow. Now, in a market, in a market where we see with a shortage like this, likely would be the case that like some milk would get delivered, it get put up on the shelves, and it would quickly sell out. So what that would mean is that you couldn't just go to the store whenever you want and happen to buy milk. Most of the time, when you go to the store, there might be no milk on the shelves, no milk in the containers. So that's going to make it hard if you really need to get milk and there's no milk available. So you might, on a day in which you think that the grocery store is going to get a delivery of milk available, look to start lining up. And so the people might, this shortage might translate into things like long lines of people waiting for milk. And in some sense, that's raising the price to the people who are going to get milk. Because if you know that, like, say, on a Monday morning, there's going to be a delivery of milk, and there'll be milk on the shelves of the store, you might spend all of Sunday night waiting in line, waiting to buy milk, because you want to be first into the store on the Monday morning to buy milk. So, in effect, you have a lower price. You pay fewer dollars per gallon of milk, but you might end up incurring some costs in other ways, like, say, waiting in line to try to be actually able to purchase milk. And that's got to be factored in. Are you really making these low-income families are struggling to afford to buy milk better off? Well, they're paying less for milk, but they might have to be waiting or having a hard time in getting a hold of it, and you've got that inconvenience that could factor in there. Another thing that can happen is that the quality of the good could decline. So, for instance, producers might put preservatives in milk to help make sure that it stays fresh longer. But those preservatives are expensive, and they might start eliminating putting those preservatives in milk, so the milk would spoil faster. That could be a decline in the quality. That you'd get a gallon of milk, and maybe it ends up like spoiling before you use all of it, and that means it's not as good as the milk that you were buying before at the equilibrium price. So that could be another way we could have effects. And then finally, we might see a black market for a good emerge. And that would be, again, another consequence of this shortage and this permanent shortage. There are people who want milk who are not going to be able to buy it at the price-controlled price. They will seek to try to get, if they really want to have milk, they might seek to try to get it in other ways. And one of the things you might observe happen, and we mentioned this back when we were talking about equilibrium, if somebody in front of you gets the last gallon of milk, and you see somebody leaving the store with the last gallon of milk, you might stop them on the way out and say, "Hey, I'll buy that milk from you. I'll pay you $4 for it." The person bought it for $2; they could resell it for $4. And so you might start to see the price of milk. You might start to see milk resold, really sort of on what you call a black market, what we would call a black market. That you go to the store and the milk's already sold out, and then you come out of the store thinking you're going to go home empty-handed, and there's somebody out in the parking lot, and they say, "Hey, Did you need to get some milk? And they might be selling it to you for a higher price. And so again, when we look in, and then people might be, showing up in line to get the milk with the intent of reselling it, with the intent of diverting it to the black market. So there are a whole bunch of additional effects that might occur. So our first thing to look at, like QS, would be the quantity available at a price of Pmax, and so the price ceiling is to some extent achieving its a goal, but not completely achieving its goal. That might not be the full story. When we start to think about what happens, what are some of the longer term consequences of the shortage, then some of these advantages, so lower prices, seemingly lower price of milk, could start to go away for the consumers. They might have to wait in line. They might get lower quality milk, and they might have to, they might see that very little of the milk is actually available for sale. It's being diverted into a black market. Just as if you want to go to try to buy a concert tickets, or and when you go to try to buy them from from Ticketmaster for the event itself, they're always sold out. But then there are tickets available on secondary sites for a lot more than the tickets were going originally. Well, those secondary brokers have bought up the available tickets, and then they're holding them for resale. So you could, in that case, then when the price isn't set to clear the market, then we're not completely using price to ration the good. And some of the things we normally think of, because when we think of equilibrium prices, because of that correspondence of buyers' plans and sellers' plans that we talked about on the video, talk about equilibrium, then any buyer could show up at the market, and they can pretty much be assured that they'll be able to buy the good at the price, that they'll be able to carry out their plan. But the shortage, another way of thinking about this shortage here that we see, that QD is greater than QS, is that the plans of buyers and sellers don't get harmonized, and they continue to be disharmonized. And so that's one of the consequences of having a price ceiling on a good. So in the book, they also talk about the long run effect versus the short run effects of a price ceiling. Basically, what happens is that in the long run, the supply of a good is going to become more elastic. Now, we haven't, that's a term we haven't used because it was defined in chapter 4, and this is macro, so we're skipping that. But what that really sort of means is that in the long run, the supply curve will become flatter. And what that means is that in the long run, there's usually going to be more of a decrease in the quantity supplied than there would be in the short run. And it depends on the market, but with the market for milk, for instance, if you're dairy farmers and you've invested in herds of dairy cattle, and now a price ceiling is put on the market on the price of milk, well, if you've just invested in dairy cattle, so you've bought a bunch of dairy cattle and set up a dairy farm, you've incurred a bunch of expenses, and you probably don't want to write that all off immediately. So you'll probably keep producing milk for some time. But in the future, you might not plan to have as large a herd of milk, so a herd of dairy cows. And so that quantity supply, that reduction in quantity supplied, is going to be greater in the long run. So if anything, the effects of a price ceiling that we're identifying here tend to become worse in the long run than they would be in the short run. So that's a price ceiling. I'll have a separate video here on a price floor as well to discuss those effects.